Whenever you talk about changing the world, somebody's going to tell you that that's not human nature. The human nature is competitive and warlike and tribalist, and we're always in an all-out war with one another. And there's only this bare tension holding the world together, holding our society together. As soon as you let that go and snap it, you suddenly have chaos in the streets. The Joker's idea from various movies that as soon as you give people a chance, they're animals and they're going to eat each other alive. That's a common understanding of human nature. And it's one that is rather conveniently supported by the current system we're in. We have a competitive capitalist society, and if it's true that human nature is inherently competitive, warlike, and always in a striving for dominance, then a society that pushes those who do the most competition, who fight the most, and who put others down without any consideration for their needs the fastest, the society that puts those people to the front is going to be extremely successful. It's going to be the society that we're sort of destined to be within our culture. But what if I were to tell you that right now you have enough information in front of you, you have enough historical knowledge to know that that's not true? That there's some part of you that knows that we are not in a war of all versus all. That it's not this bare skein of civility that holds us from constant warfare. That we actually have the ability to adjust and mitigate human nature, and that there's many different human natures. There isn't just this competitive drive. There are other natures that we can engender to improve society and improve our lives. And that you already know this. That either it's not the society is intensely competitive at all times and always fighting in an all versus all battle, and that maybe we are actually a very collaborative, cooperative society underneath all of these negative side effects of our current system order. Either we are more collaborative than people think, or there's at the very least countervailing pressures in the human psyche. In other words, we have some parts of us that want to compete and take over, and some parts of us that want to collaborate, work together, and build art together. That both of those can actually play together in society and in the human psyche. And therefore, there isn't a singular human nature. That human nature is either very complex or maybe doesn't exist at all. And I don't have to prove this to you because you already know it. You maybe have told yourself humans are always fighting, that there's nothing we can do about it. But there's something inside you that already knows that's not true. And I'm going to try and demonstrate it here with 3 specific approaches to that argument. To dismantle the idea that human beings are inherently competitive, violent, and cannot be stopped from their aggressive tribalism. I'm going to prove that using examples that we already know. I'm also going to suggest that we have alternate natures. And I'm finally going to suggest that maybe we don't have a nature at all. That while all animals have some sort of nature, that the complexities cannot be broken down into simply good versus evil, competitive versus collaborative, that maybe it's not such a simple way to understand human society or really any intelligent species. And we're going to start with part 1. Where I examine this idea that we are in an all versus all battle. Because there's certainly enough evidence to suggest that these kind of battles are happening. I mean, you can look at international conflicts right now, the scramble for oil in the Middle East, the constant fighting between ethnic groups, the support for that fighting by powered, moneyed interests that are constantly pushing for additional warfare. You can also see it in the schoolyard. Kids who will try and create a clique or a pecking order in any situation. They might be in a sports team and say, I'm the top guy, you guys got to follow me, and anybody who doesn't, I'm going to give them a pounding. You can also see people who will cause all kinds of strife in the world in order to prove that they're the top ones, they're the top dog. You can see it in the military. You can see it in many institutions where there are people who will attempt to take control by dominating and domineering others. And you certainly see violence, crime in the streets, all kinds of issues that can't just be wiped away. We can't just say, well, these things don't happen, because they do. Our history books emphasize war. They emphasize those bits of conflict, partially because they're interesting, partially because they're illustrative of the world we live in today. We want to learn from history. And when we look at the history of any culture, we tend to focus on the warfare and the violence, unless we're trying to laud them as, say, a noble savage or something like that. These people never had warfare. They were very peaceful. And as soon as we undermine that, we say, aha, they had warfare, they had slavery, these other issues. We wrap them into the same concept of human nature. It's because they, of course, couldn't control those impulses, because humans can't control those impulses, because humans have a natural need to destroy and dominate. But looking at the history in a more detailed fashion shows pockets throughout any history of any culture in the world. You already know from your understanding of culture that there have been many communities, communes, even peace villages within times of war. And within any time of war, any high level of strife, there's always a large contingent of people that really have nothing to do with fighting. Even during the most deadly and dire parts of war, like, you find people that are living their lives amongst the rubble, amongst the fires, who are eating dinner, going to concerts, writing music, creating works of art. The majority of people, in fact, are not involved in those conflicts. And the question you got to ask is why? If human nature is inherently violent and full of the desire for control and dominance, why wouldn't people flock to those battles? Why would they want that home life? Why would they want to stay home and not engage? Well, we're going to get to there in a moment. But think about when you walk downtown. When you walk downtown, many people's idea or vision that they get downtown, partially created through a complicit media, is this idea that everyone's going to rob you, everyone's going to mug you. And indeed, you might live in a city with high levels of inequality where muggings and crime are more likely due to the vast inequalities in wealth. But remember, I say that word due to. If you walk through a small town, you might find a guy who wants to dominate everybody, Big Joe. And Big Joe walks around and he goes, you know what? If you don't do what I say, I'll beat the crap out of you, right? And Big Joe is out there. There's guys out there who want to dominate everything. Mostly guys, some women, who want to control everything around them. But even they don't get in fist fights every single day. Even they don't rob everyone they see. The most of the time when we walk through downtown, we see people cooperating or collaborating in the economic system. We see people buying donuts or shopping for clothes or going out with their family. And there's some squabbles happening there, some power dynamics, but they're also having fun. They're eating pizza together. They're looking at works of art that were created by teams. The majority of time spent in the world is not spent fighting one another in an all-out war. I went to a high school that was very aggressive. There were people that hated one another, and there were fights that happened every day, pretty much. But the 90% of students weren't engaged in those fights. But the majority of time, they were studying, reading, or doing other stuff they're not supposed to get to at school, all kinds of activities that really have nothing to do with warfare and domination and everything to do with hedonism, with that sense of fun, with enjoying yourself. And when you look around at your own life, you don't see a war of all versus all. It's not a realistic way to look at the world around you. So when we talk about society as an all versus all battle, it doesn't really match our observation of the world around us. Now, we might say there's a reason for that, and that's the police. The police, the military, God keeps us in check, keeps us from wanting to kill each other. If it weren't for these religious institutions and the fear of reprisal from God or from the police or from the military or something else like that, we would kill everyone. We'd go around, as soon as the purge legalized all crime, we'd go out and we'd kill that guy who says something mean to us at the grocery store. And certainly I feel rage on a daily basis about certain things. But I guarantee I'm not going to go out and kill my children just because it would be legally acceptable under the purge. I love my children. I love my family. And you love your family. You might hate certain members of your family. You might have a terrible relationship with them. But on some level, you want to protect them and you care about them. This is something you know about yourself, and you should be able to take that knowledge and understand it about others as well. that we as humans tend to love each other's families, and we even love people outside our families. We raise money for charity. We give to our neighbor. We don't do it all the time, maybe not as much as you think we ought to, but we do it to such an extent that it can't be true that all we care about is dominance and domination. Now you might say, again, it's the police. It's keeping us in order. If that's true, then we know that we have the ability to mitigate or control that urge. In other words, if human nature really is violent and aggressive, the fact we don't see violence and aggression all day long in every wike of life, every single area, where we don't see constant fighting, conflict, and domination, where we don't see a return to instantaneous slavery, demonstrates to us, and should demonstrate to you, that that nature is at the very least controllable through laws and agreements, if it exists at all. In other words, either we are not inherently violent, controlling, and dominating, or that desire to take on those things, to become more dominant, take on violence, theft, and criminality, and all these kind of ills, can be mitigated through laws and agreements. Now, I think that's a relatively weak argument, because we can look throughout cultures throughout history where there have been massive, amazing collaborations between various cultures. People who collaborate both in their culture and across cultural lines has always existed. Yes, there's been warfare, but there's also been collaboration, art. It's impossible to imagine a society that could somehow collaborate enough to create homesteads, to farm, or even not to farm, but to hunt together and gather together in large groups, even to create language and communicate with each other and create songs and all these other collaborative efforts, that it was secretly all war, and all of the anthropological evidence we have is just wrong. That secretly there was a constant warfare between these groups, nothing holding it together except when we finally came up with Christianity thousands of years later. Now, I'm not saying there was no conflict, by the way, no warfare. Some people might take what I said and they might misconstrue that to mean that I think that there were no wars in prehistoric peoples. That's just false. But most of the evidence we have suggests that as much as there were wars and tribalism in that time, or in those times, we also had interbreeding between cultures that eventually caused one culture to disappear and another one to be supplanted, just through interbreeding and through cultural exchange. It wasn't that people were always fighting, it was that there was some fighting and some of this other thing, this collaboration, this working together, this ability to get rid of conflicts or to eliminate conflict between cultures. So, when you walk around and you observe the world around you, and you do it honestly, you see that there isn't a lot of positive evidence for an all versus all battle where we all want dominance. Yes, at certain points we all want to be dominant. Yes, warfare exists. Absolutely. But in any situation that you pick apart and examine on a closer basis, you see large examples of collaboration. You might explain that through legal controls or through fear of God, although as an atheist myself, who has never murdered anybody or even had the urge to do so, I think the idea that it is my fear of God that keeps me from killing everyone to be somewhat irrational. It just doesn't. Either I am not a human being, or that's just not true. In other words, that we have other impulses that can overcome that violent impulse. So that's the first point. We know, and you can look around and see that dominant impulse, that impulse towards dominance, violence, and constant fighting for power cannot be our only nature, or it must be mitigated from other factors. So if we were going to say we want to change the world, but we can't because human nature is too competitive, too violent, we already know that it's not what humans are. We already know that humans don't have an uncontrollable urge to destroy one another, or else all this evidence around us wouldn't exist. We must either be able to control it with fear, or we must have some other impulse that explains these differences. There's a way around that. We don't have the ability to say we're always fighting, and here's the example: show people not fighting. Doesn't make sense. It's irrational and illogical. Now, it might still be true, by the way. There might be some magical explanation for why I'm not trying to kill everyone I see. There might be some other explanation I don't know about, but it's no longer a rational argument or a logical argument. It becomes an argument based on faith. So let's get away with that step one and say, all right, humans aren't always violent, but is there any evidence that we are collaborative, cooperative, and that collaboration or cooperation isn't based entirely on fear or on the sense of shame? Well, in my mind, it doesn't matter if it's shame or fear. If we are collaborating, we're collaborating. And it doesn't matter what's inside here if the thing that happens on the outside is a work of art, is peaceful, is love. If I'm only loving my children because I want them to carry on my name, which I think is a ludicrous idea, and not actually due to the oxytocin that causes us to love one another, if we are to say that I only do that for selfish reasons, but the impact is the same as if it weren't the case. In other words, if we were to say, he's secretly being selfish, but you can't tell, then there's no real impulse or impact on our society as a whole. There's no impact of something that you can just imagine is in someone's head when the evidence in front of you says otherwise. If it's true that I'm helping my children because of pure selfish reasons, but the impact is that they are healthy and happy and that we love one another, then it must also be true we could create a different system or a different society where those impulses are still in here, but the outer world is showing a better way of doing things, a more egalitarian, socially sharing, other kinds of aspects of society are improved because of something else we've changed, even though inside we're still just as selfish as we ever were. If that's the case, then it doesn't really matter what's in here, right? It matters what's out there. That's the impact that we want to see in the world. So what about this idea that that's only because of the law? That if it weren't for the law and the rules and God, that we would revert to killing everyone. I would go out and murder all the people that I see in the world who are smaller than me, and they would all, being bigger than me, beat me to death and steal all my stuff. When you look at the history of any major wars in history, to use the word history far too many times in one sentence, you see that humans are always being told that their enemies are evil. And they're not easily able to accept that until they've been reinforced through legends, folk tales, movies, film strips. There are so many ways to try and teach us that the enemies of our state are somehow evil, non-human. They're creatures, monsters. We look at the horrifying results of World War I and the massive amounts of death and destruction that happened then, the internment of Japanese people in North America, the current genocides happening in Israel and Gaza. We find situations where people are constantly bombarded with the message, these people are evil. We're getting rid of this evil force of terrorists so I could kill anyone I want in that region as long as I'm officially a soldier. I have no interest in doing that. But people are told constantly these are non-humans. These are evil. They're going to kill you and your family if you don't do something about it. And even so, studies have shown that when people come back from war, they tend to have PTSD. They tend to have post-traumatic stress disorder. They tend to have various psychological conditions caused by the stress of having to kill people and cause violence, because people don't like doing it. At the moment, you can be a torturer and enjoy the work that you're doing, laugh at the pain you're causing others. But torturers, when they come back home, that pain causes their lives to destabilize, and they end up in all these very terrible situations. Soldiers come back weeping. Soldiers come back unable to stand the idea of killing, or thinking back what they did with great remorse and regret. So they have everything working in their favor. Their enemies are evil. The law says not only can they kill somebody, they have to. They're even provided a lot of money to do it and other incentives, but they still come back traumatized. Why is that? Why do people come back traumatized from war when they're allowed to do it? It can't be because they're afraid of reprisals and law, because reprisals and law are in their favor. They've been told these are enemies of God. These are enemies of each other. when they come back and they're miserable and depressed, not all of them, but when the large number of soldiers come back and they can't face the world around them, when they look with depression at what they've done and they look back and have terrible flashbacks, it can't be because they're afraid of God, because they're afraid of the law, because that was in their favor. It must be that there's another aspect of their personality which is telling them this is wrong to do. It might be their religious upbringing, but again, there are many atheists who come back, just as some people who lose their faith in God actually lose their faith in God because of the killing. So it can't be that they're afraid of going to hell, because they've been told they're going to heaven. That they're afraid of the law coming after them, because they know what they did was legal. There's another thing that's causing them to look back and recognize that what they did was on some level wrong, even if it seemed right at the instance or the only thing they could do. So when you look at humans and how they interact with warfare, we know that it's not human nature that says, this is great, I love killing these people. At the moment, there may be some adrenaline running through them. People in the comments might say that they enjoyed killing people a lot. They're probably lying, but they might be saying that truthfully. But a large percentage of soldiers come back with distress over what they've done. And it's not because of those systems of fear. So we know for a fact that people's morality, people's ethics, when it comes to causing harm to others, isn't exclusively caused by law and fear of reprisal. That's not factually correct based on the evidence we have. There must be some other thing at work. So, could that be another aspect of human nature? Could humans have a nature that just as easily becomes violent as it does becomes collaborative, cooperative, and peaceful? Or maybe even more dominantly so towards peace. After all, propaganda spends billions of dollars to create these illusions of evil. If it were unnecessary to do that, why would they spend all this money? Why would so much time be spent trying to teach you that our enemies are evil and that we need them to save our society? If it weren't for this belief that we need to protect ourselves, and ourselves can be a very wide net, it could even be the entire world, from evil. If we weren't for this belief that we have to help others, there would be no warfare. If we didn't have the ability to look and say, I think that we should kill those people because they're going to destroy us, destroy our families, or destroy some other family, that we need to liberate these people from the autarkies that want to control them. If it weren't for those impulses, people would easily resist the desire to go to warfare because they would have no reason to do it. The rich and powerful of the very top, we can argue all day whether they just want power and money, and they may indeed want that. But certainly the majority of people on an everyday basis go to war because they think they're helping their families, they think they're helping their community, they think they're helping the people of that country, they're saving the world against evil. So it is only because of that sense that they are belonging to a community that can be quite wide, including other countries. We've often gone to countries saying that we're going to liberate them. It is only because of that sense of community that spans nations and spans the world that allows us to come up with an excuse for going to war. So there must be an element of our nature or of our culture that tells us it is wrong to harm and it is right to help. And to be fair, it would be illogical if that weren't true. Because humans have developed communication. We've developed language. We've developed laws. Remember, the laws that control us were created by humans with the intention of reducing harm. The religious texts that we read, they may have been inspired by God, but there's many stories in there that were created by humans in an attempt to improve our lives, to get rid of some of the harms and make the world a better place. In other words, it's human morality that defines religion rather than the other way around. Now, you might disagree with that. You might say, no. God is my source of ethics, and all you atheists are just lying to yourself. Secretly, you believe in God, or secretly you are getting it from somewhere else, from your culture, and it's not some part of human nature that does this. But look at the history of laws going back, even prior to the birth of Jesus. They're referenced in the Bible. There are many laws created with an attempt to create a society that's more egalitarian, to eliminate harm towards another, to eliminate things like murder. We know that humans are the ones creating laws. We also know that humans have created all kinds of amazing creations of art that have had to be done collaboratively. Giant statues, pyramids, other things like that. Now you might say the people who built the pyramids were all slaves. Now we know historically that's not true. Actually, that people came from different areas to work on the pyramids, partially because they really did believe in the glory of the god king. But regardless of just the pyramids and how they were built themselves, there are many other great works of art that were created with large groups of people that had to collaborate, sometimes many long hours of unpaid labor in order to create something in the vision of their own god. Cathedrals, churches, castles, these things were built by paid labor, but people had to collaborate and work together in order to do it. And we don't know the reason why certain pieces of art were created today anyway. We can assume that people were afraid and were told they had to do it. But when people create massive works of art, they are trying to celebrate their gods and their kings, which is a cultural artifact. So we create laws, we create art, we create all kinds of things culturally because we want to create a better society, a better world, that we see ourselves as part of a greater whole. And that's just something we know from the history books and from our own experience. We don't need to delve very deeply through history to know that there are aspects of the world, such as language and communication and songs and stories, that are the basis for all culture, that were created in order for people to get along, in order to help us on our collaborative hunts, in order for us to create a cohesion, for us to build society or cities. Everything from totem poles to cathedrals were built because we were trying to develop society, a culture. So the idea that people are inherently non-collaborative, non-cooperative, just isn't borne out by evidence. And indeed, altruism, the idea that there are the ability for us to look out for other people's needs, is basically true for all forms of life, not just intelligent life. There are many cases where there are animal species that need to work together in order to survive, that they actually will help one another, even though they may not be intelligent enough to really understand why. That altruism is a basis for what allows life to thrive on Earth. And we can see social altruism everywhere around us through history. We see people helping people who have fallen into the river and pull them out of the mud, even though we don't know them or are not going to get anything directly from them. We've heard the poem that says, "Ask not for whom the bell tolls, it tolls for thee." The idea that anyone who dies or suffers in society is in some way connected and that we are all responsible for each other. These ideas of altruism might be based in selfishness. They might be based in the idea that I'm a better person if I help you. But the altruism still exists in either case. Whatever's in here, on the outside, is altruism. In other words, I don't have to be a good person to be altruistic. I can be doing it for my own selfish desire to be recognized as a great person or a person of great largesse. I can be donating money so that I feel less ashamed about the things I've done. But in terms of the impact on the world, it's the same thing. Altruism is visible all around us, and there's considerably more altruism when we think about it than there is violence and domination. Sure, violence and domination do a lot of damage in a short period of time, but it's altruism that builds those things back up again, that builds cities in the first place. It's altruism that allows us to create a social safety net. It's altruism that allows us to have language. It's altruism that allows us to care for the dead and the sick. It's altruism that creates all the hospitals in the world. It's altruism potentially that created things like Stonehenge and many other great artifacts that show that we were trying to pray to a god that would protect us and bring us great crops and would help our world in some way. It's altruism that makes us feel like we've got to be part of the hunt. We've got to go out and help people get those berries, and we're going to share them with the community. That act of altruism is the basis for all culture. And all intelligent animal species work together, collaborate, and that's one of the hallmarks of an intelligent species. Take a look at whales or dolphins or other intelligent species with a social aspect. They have to work together, and that intelligence allows them to see how it can be beneficial to the entire pod or the entire herd when they work together. And there are many simian ape cultures that are based around altruism. They something like a chimpanzee is relatively violent, but they still have a culture and have cultural practices that work together relatively peacefully. Even in the animal kingdom, when you see a lion, it comes to the same watering hole as the gazelle and only hunts when it's hungry. The lion is not in an all-on-all war with the gazelle. They are not fighting all the time. Humans are not fighting all the time. But there's plenty of examples of altruism. Also, cross-species altruism is something that's been studied. Species will help each other when there's no clear advantage to that species, but it helps overall with the survival of all species. Survival of all species depends on altruism. It depends on us reaching out to our neighbors. If we didn't take care of small babies when we see them and we just thought, it's weaker than us, so I'll just eat it. If that's how we acted, society wouldn't survive. Human beings wouldn't have survived this long. It can only survive with altruism. Whether or not it's selfishly based in here, the outside is definitely altruism. So at the very least, there's a human nature towards altruism, as there is with any intelligent species. Even if there isn't, it has the same impact of altruism. We know that altruism is the result, even if it's not what's in here. So either human nature pushes towards altruism, or some invisible force that we don't understand yet does that. But again, that gets to non-scientific views. So we know that we're not in an all versus all war with constant competition. We just know that because we looked at that first point and we were able to determine that, yes, we don't have evidence for that out in the world. And we also know that it's not just law and fear, because we can find examples where it's not law and fear that drive people, and despite law and fear, people still feel the same way about harming others. And we know that altruism is one of the key features of an intelligent species, and that there's plenty of examples of altruism. Whether or not we still think there's something secretly, some secret law or some other internal thing, that's no longer logical or rational. That's just an assumption that we have. But it could very well be true. But if we want to change society, does it matter what's in here, or does it matter what's out there? Let's talk about what we could do as a society. We have a lot of forces pushing us towards competition and warfare. We have a scramble over resources such as oil. We are always seeing the enemy and being told about the enemy and that we have to defeat them. We are put in a society that is based around competition and based around whoever competes the best wins, gets the most money, gets the most stuff. So of course you'd expect human beings to learn to become more competitive, to fight one another for dominance. In a society based around the dominance as a key feature, that is around a capitalist society where whoever has the most wins, then of course we would expect people to be competitive and more warlike. When we are saying we have limited resources and we need to take those so we can make profit, then why wouldn't people go to war and take profit? That doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense we expect something different when we create that society. If we were to create a different society with different laws and different rules and a different basis, more of a society based around, say, collaboration, cooperation, we would expect people to act more collaboratively and cooperatively because we've changed the rules of society. Now, there are many problematic examples throughout history of societies that claimed to be collaborative and cooperative, and they were still relatively top-down and competitive. Something like the Soviet Union, for example, which claimed to be a socialist society where everyone was equal, and yet at the very top is Stalin, who wants you to tell on your neighbors and get them to be arrested. The Chinese culture, where, again, the Chinese government was telling people to snitch on their parents. Now, is that a society of egalitarianism and equality? I mean, I would argue that that's a rational statement to make. That a society based around competition to see who survives and to push out your enemies and to see everyone as an enemy can't possibly be seen as an attempt to create an egalitarian shared society without hierarchies. It just doesn't fly. It flies in the face of the evidence that's been presented to us. We've been shown a society which is designed around competition and said, guess what? This is an example of the most collaborative society possible. It's irrational. The same with our own society. We should not be expecting the most amount of collaborative, cooperative society in a system that is designed around competition. That's just illogical. And we can look at many cultures throughout history where there have been more or less amounts of competition. No utopias, but societies where collaboration and competition are seen a little differently as they are today. I'm not arguing we can completely get rid of violence, that we can completely get rid of the urge to compete. I'm not trying to make that claim. I'm just arguing against the idea that human nature is inherently violent, competitive, and an all versus all battle. You may have believed that at the beginning of this video, but if you followed the logic so far, you can't possibly believe that now. And I've also, I think, demonstrated beyond really any credible doubt that either humans are not inherently violent, or that we can at least mitigate that violence and aggression with laws and fear. So even if we wanted to change society and we still believed we had that impulse, we would be able to change the laws and thus change the impact on society. Let's say that we go beyond that, though. We make the argument that humans' sense of morality isn't just based on law and God, because we can demonstrate that that's true. So we know there must be something else. Maybe it's human nature, maybe it's not. Then we can say that if we were to change the rules of society, we would expect the amount of collaboration, cooperation to change with it. Maybe not perfectly, but we would shift the spectrum along. In other words, if competition at the highest level is here, and collaboration at the highest level is here, that imaginable right where my light is, we would say that maybe we're here on the competitive scale and we could be this competitive, but we could be this collaborative. Never maybe this collaborative, but this far might be possible. When we get into vague comments of justice, equality, violence, aggression, and tribalism and say those are all human nature, we don't have strong enough evidence to make those kind of generic claims. I've already gone to show that it's at least more complex than we think, if it exists at all. So the next time people say to you, well, you can't change society, things aren't going to change because that's just human nature, remember that you already know that human nature isn't immutable. That human nature is either more generous, more loving, and more sharing than you've been led to believe, or that it's just more complex and impossible to determine that it's a single thing or a single other thing that defines the core of human behavior. That we can change the way the world is with laws and with social structures, and we can't rely on human nature as an excuse to avoid change, because change is happening. We don't have an ability to prevent that. So, at the beginning of this argument, you may have believed that humans had an immutable human nature. But if you've been following this argument, I don't think it's possible for you to believe that now. But your choice to accept the logic and arguments I've made or to challenge them is up to you. You can put in the comments how you disagree, how you think that I'm a fool for believing in my optimistic vision of human beings, and that actually Q from Star Trek was right in the first episode of Star Trek: The Next Generation, that we're essentially a race of barbarians that are going to try and kill each other and have done nothing but harm one another. These are certainly possible views to have. I don't think that they are borne out by the evidence that I presented, and I don't think they're borne out by the evidence you've collected in your life. And if you look back through your life, I think you'll agree that human nature either doesn't exist the way we've been told, or just a little more complex than that.